There are some things a person does every single day, and most people never think twice about them. They just become part of the landscape, like the frost that settles on the water trough every November morning, or the way the cottonwoods go yellow before anything else does. You stop seeing them, you stop asking why. But I've learned that the things we stop asking about are sometimes the most important ones. And this story is about a man who did one quiet, unremarkable thing every single week, and a woman who noticed when everyone else had long since stopped looking. His name was Fletcher Dunne. He was 41 years old, broad across the shoulders in the way that comes not from a gym but from 20 years of lifting feed sacks and fence posts, and the general weight of a life lived outdoors. He ran cattle on a stretch of land about 12 miles northeast of a small Colorado town called Harwick, a place with one main street, a general store, a church that leaned slightly to the west, and a public library that occupied the front half of what used to be the old telegraph office. Fletcher came to town every Thursday. He came for supplies, mostly, but every Thursday without fail he also walked through the door of that library. He never checked anything out. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it matters. He came every single week. He stayed sometimes for the better part of an hour. He walked the shelves slowly, the way a man walks when he's in no hurry and has nowhere particular to be, running his fingers along the spines of books the way another man might run his hand along a fence line, testing, feeling but not stopping. And then he left. Without a book, without a card, without so much as a word to the woman behind the desk. Every Thursday for almost 2 years her name was Cecily Marsh. She was 37, and she had been the librarian at Harwick Public since she came back from Denver 6 years prior. After a life she didn't talk about much and a marriage she talked about even less. She was the kind of woman who remembered everything. The way a patron held a book, whether they read the last page first, whether they came in when it rained or only when it was sunny. People thought she was quiet. She wasn't. She was listening. She noticed Fletcher Dunne the very first Thursday he came in. She noticed the hat he turned in his hands when he thought no one was looking. She noticed the way his lips moved slightly when he stood in front of the natural history section, like he was sounding something out to himself. She noticed that he always chose the same corner of the room, the one farthest from the window where the light was worst. And she noticed very early on that his eyes never tracked across a page the way a reader's eyes do. They moved in a different pattern altogether. Slower. More uncertain. Cecily had grown up with a younger brother who couldn't read. She knew what that looked like. She knew what it cost a person to hide it. And she never once said a word. The town of Harwick was small enough that everyone knew Fletcher Dunne, at least by reputation. He'd inherited the ranch from his father, who'd inherited it from his. The land had been in the family long enough that people sometimes just called the Northeast Ridge Dunne country, without thinking about it. Fletcher had run it alone since his father passed 8 years ago. He had no wife, no hired hands that stayed more than a season, and no particular interest in the social machinery of a small town. The potlucks, the town meetings, the way people gathered on the hardware store porch on Saturday afternoons and talked about nothing for hours. He wasn't unfriendly. He would nod. He would answer if asked a direct question. He paid his debts on time and in full, and that counted for something in Harwick. But he didn't linger. He never lingered, except in that library. The first time Cecily paid him any particular attention, beyond her initial quiet noting, was on a Thursday in late October, about 3 months after he'd started coming in. A cold front had come through the night before, and the town smelled like wood smoke and something sharp underneath, the way Colorado smells when winter is done being polite about arriving. Fletcher came in at his usual time, a little after 2 in the afternoon. He was wearing a heavy canvas coat she hadn't seen before, and his boots left a thin trail of dried mud near the door that she would sweep up later without annoyance. He went to the shelves, as he always did. She watched him from the corner of her eye, the way she'd learned to watch people, without making them feel watched, which is an art form and not a small one. He stopped in front of the poetry section. That surprised her. She hadn't expected poetry. He stood there for a long time. Long enough that she began to wonder. She rose from her desk, not rushing, not making a show of it, and walked toward the back of the room on the pretext of returning a book to its proper shelf. As she passed behind him, she glanced at what he was looking at. He was holding a thin volume, the kind with a dark green cloth cover that had faded at the corners from years of handling. She recognized it. It was a collection of frontier verse, poems about wide land and open sky and the particular grief of distance. She had read it herself years ago. He was holding it very carefully, the way you hold something that matters to you, even when you're not sure why yet. She said nothing. She shelved the book in her hand. She went back to her desk, but she remembered. Over the weeks that followed, Cecily began to pay attention in a different way. Not the absent cataloging attention she gave most patrons. She started to see Fletcher Dunne the way she saw a book she was trying to understand. Slowly, without rushing toward a conclusion, she noticed that he always came in after his errands were done. The feed store, the general store, the post office. She could tell because his pockets were full by then, receipts and small packages tucked away. and he carried the particular settled look of a man who has finished his obligations for the day. The library was not an errand. The library was something else. She noticed that he never brought anything to read to the chairs near the window, where the light was good and most patrons liked to sit. He stayed near the shelves, standing, like a man who wasn't sure he had permission to sit down. She noticed that he always looked at the same 3 sections: poetry, natural history, and a shelf near the back that held books about ranching and land management. The practical things. The things a man in his position would need to know. And she noticed, watching him in that section especially, that after a few minutes of standing and looking and running his finger along the spines, something in his face would close down, like a door shutting, and he would move on. She thought about that closed door for a long time. One Thursday in December, the Thursday before Christmas as it happened, when the library smelled like the pine boughs she'd laid along the windowsills, she did something she'd been thinking about for weeks. She placed a book on the table in the corner closest to where Fletcher usually stood, just left it there, face down, open to a particular page. It was the green volume of frontier verse, open to a poem about a man checking his fences alone in the first snow, watching the mountains go white in the distance and thinking about everything he'd never said to anyone. She went back to her desk. She did not watch to see what he did. When he left an hour later, he stopped by her desk for the first time in 2 years of Thursdays. He set the book down carefully right at the edge, and he said without meeting her eyes, "That's a good one." "Which one?" she asked as if she didn't know. He was quiet for a moment. "The one about the fence line," he said. She nodded. "I thought so," she said. "You can keep it if you'd like, no card required." He picked the book back up. He turned it over once in his hands, then he set it back down. "I'll be back Thursday," he said, which was the most words she'd heard from him at one time. And then he left. She didn't let herself smile until she heard the door close. He came back Thursday, and the Thursday after, and the one after that. Something shifted in those weeks, though it was the kind of shift that's hard to name while it's happening. The way the light changes in January, where you don't notice it's getting longer until one day you realize you can still see at 5 o'clock, and you don't know exactly when that started. Cecily began leaving books, not many, 1, sometimes 2, placed deliberately where he would find them, always open to something specific. A passage about canyon country. A poem that didn't rhyme but sounded when you read it aloud in your head, like the wind coming down off a ridge. A paragraph from a natural history of the Colorado Plateau, that she thought he'd find beautiful, if beauty was something he let himself notice. She never said anything about it. She just left them, and cleared them away when he was done, and filed the information away in the quiet ledger she kept in her mind. He never said much, but he started staying longer. By February he was staying almost 2 hours. He would stand in his corner, and she would work at her desk, and the library would be very quiet except for the sound of the coal stove, and the occasional creak of the building settling in the cold. She found she didn't mind the quiet. It was a different kind of quiet than the kind she usually lived in. Less like being alone, and more like being near someone without needing anything from them. One afternoon in late February, she was up on the rolling ladder that served the high shelves, retrieving a volume someone had requested from Denver, when she heard his voice below her. "Can I ask you something?" She looked down. He was standing at the base of the ladder, looking up at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not closed. Not guarded. Just uncertain, in the way a person looks when they're about to say something they've been holding for a long time. "Of course," she said, and stayed where she was on the ladder, because somehow she understood that it was easier for him to say what was about to say if she wasn't standing directly in front of him. "Those books you leave," he said. "You leave them open to the same part every time." She waited. "I was wondering," he said, and then he started again. "I was wondering if you could, if it would be too much trouble to, explain to me what they say." She came down the ladder, not fast, not slow. She held the book she'd retrieved in both hands and she looked at him. Just looked at him, steady and even, the way you look at something you're not afraid of. And she said, "That's what I'm here for." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face that she couldn't quite name. Not relief exactly. Something heavier than relief and lighter than it at the same time. "I can't read them myself," he said. His voice was quiet and entirely level, the way a man's voice gets when he's decided to stop pretending. "I never learned properly. I got some letters when I was young, and then my father got sick, and I came back to work the land, and I just never went back to it, and after a while it seemed too late to say so." He wasn't looking at the floor. "That's what I want you to know." He was looking straight at her. And that, the not looking away, that took more courage than most people will ever understand. Cecily said, "It's not too late." He looked skeptical, the way a man looks when he's heard something comforting before and it turned out to be hollow. She said, "I'm not being kind, I'm being factual. People learn to read at 60, at 70, at 80 years old. The only thing that makes it too late is deciding it's too late." He was quiet. Outside, the wind came off the ridge and pressed against the old window glass, and the coal stove ticked. "I should have said something sooner," she said then, and she meant it. I've known for a while. I wasn't sure how to offer without making you feel. She paused, choosing the word carefully. Without making you feel seen in the wrong way. He was very still for a moment. Then he said, is there a right way? I think so, she said. I think it's what I've been trying to do. Leaving things you could hold and look at, so you could decide when you were ready, on your own terms. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she wasn't sure which way it was going to go. And then he said, all right. Just that. All right. They started the following Thursday. Cecily set up the table in the back corner. The one farthest from the window, the one he'd always preferred, and now she understood exactly why. She brought a primer, the kind used for adults, with no illustrations that would make a grown man feel condescended to, just plain words and clean page layouts. She brought paper and a pencil. She poured coffee from the small pot. She kept on the stove in the back room and set a cup at each place without asking whether he wanted it. Fletcher Dunne sat down across from her and looked at the primer and looked at the pencil and looked at his own hands, which were large and calloused, and had spent 40 years doing everything except this. Where do we start? He asked. Where you are, she said. Tell me what you know. He told her. He knew his letters, most of them, the way you know the names of constellations. You can point to them one at a time, but they don't yet make a shape you can read. He knew a handful of words by sight, his name, a few others. He could count and calculate in his head with a speed that surprised her, because people who can't read often develop extraordinary memory and math to compensate. She noted that carefully. It told her something about how he learned. She didn't start with the primer. She started with the poem. She read it to him first. The one about the fence line. The one he'd said was a good one, and she watched his face while she read it. He listened the way people listen when they're hearing something they've felt but never had words for. Still and intent, with that quality of concentrated attention that you almost never see in anyone anymore. When she finished, she said, now we're going to take it apart, word by word, and I'm going to show you how the letters make the sounds, and the sounds make the words, and the words make that. She gestured at the page, what you felt when I read it. He looked at the poem, he looked at her. That's what reading is, he said. That's what reading is, she said. He picked up the pencil. His grip on it was tentative in a way that nothing else about him was tentative, and she recognized that too. The specific vulnerability of a new skill. The feeling of being a beginner in a body that has long since stopped expecting to be one. Your grip doesn't matter, she said. Not yet. We'll get to that. He looked up at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, the corner of his mouth moved in something approaching a smile. It lasted about half a second, but she saw it. The weeks that followed were some of the most quietly remarkable she could remember. Fletcher came every Thursday, same as always, but now he sat at the table instead of standing at the shelves, and the library felt different in the hours he was there. Purposeful in a way it sometimes didn't feel on the ordinary days when people came and went without much intention. He was a serious student. That didn't surprise her. He was a serious man. What surprised her was how fast certain things came once they began. He had, as she'd suspected, a strong mind that had simply been traveling without a map. Once she gave him the tools to decode the marks on a page, he moved through them with the determination of someone who had been waiting a long time for permission to begin. He struggled with certain sounds, the ones that were spelled one way and pronounced another. The English language's long tradition of inconsistency that frustrates even people who've been reading their whole lives. He got frustrated sometimes. Not at her. At the page, the way a man gets frustrated at a piece of equipment that won't cooperate. A controlled and focused frustration that he worked through methodically rather than set it aside. She admired that about him. She didn't say so. There was a Thursday in March when he arrived looking like he hadn't slept, and she could tell from the set of his jaw that something had gone wrong on the ranch. A calf lost maybe, or something with the fence lines or the water. One of the quiet catastrophes that ranchers absorb without complaint, because complaining doesn't fix fences. She put the primer aside that day and read to him instead a long chapter from a natural history book about the geology of the Colorado Plateau, how the canyon country had been carved by water over unimaginable time, how what looked permanent was always at a geological scale just passing through. He listened. He didn't say anything for a while, and then he said, "Sometimes I forget the land was here before the trouble." She thought about that sentence for a long time afterward. It was the kind of thing a poet says without knowing he's a poet. It was a Tuesday in April, not a Thursday, which told her something about the urgency when he came in. She was alone, the afternoon light coming in flat and golden through the west window, the kind of light that makes dust look like something worth seeing. He had a piece of paper in his hand. He set it on her desk and stood back, the same distance he'd kept from her on that first Thursday 2 years ago, and she understood instinctively that she was supposed to read it first, alone. She looked down at it. The handwriting was uncertain in the way that new handwriting always is. The letters formed carefully, some leaning one way and some another. But it was legible. She read it. It was a poem, his own. 6 lines about a ridge in early morning, when the light comes sideways and turns the grass silver before it turns it gold. About the way silence sounds different when there's someone you trust nearby. About noticing things. Not grand things, not dramatic things, but the small ordinaries that most people are too busy to see and that he'd been cataloging his whole life without knowing what to do with them. She read it twice. Then she looked up at him. He was watching her with an expression she recognized now, the particular look of a person who has put something real in front of another person and is waiting to see if it survives the exposure. She said, "Fletcher," he said. "I know it's not. Don't," she said, not unkindly. "Just, don't diminish it. Don't do that. It's good. The image of the grass, silver before it turns gold, that's precise, that's the thing good poetry does. It names what you've always seen and couldn't say." He looked at her for a moment. Something settled in him. She could see it happen, the way water settles after you've stirred it. "I wrote it for you," he said. "Not in a..." He paused and she could see him picking words with care. "I mean to say I wrote it because of you, because you gave me the means to write it, and I didn't know how else to say thank you for that." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, carefully and without any performance, "You could come back next Thursday and keep learning. That would be thanks enough." He looked at her steadily. "I'll be here Thursday," he said. "I'll also be here Saturday if you'd let me take you to supper. Not as student and teacher." She had not expected that, which was unusual for her. She who noticed everything. She hadn't seen that coming, and that itself told her something. She said, "Saturday is fine." He nodded once, the way he confirmed everything, direct and without elaboration. He picked up the poem from her desk and put it back in his coat pocket. She almost said leave it, but she didn't. He'd given her the words. He could keep the paper, he said. "Good evening, Miss Marsh." "Good evening, Mr. Dunne," she said, and that was that, as simple and as uncommon as that. "I'll tell you what I know of what came after. Because the story doesn't end at Saturday's supper, though the shape of it changes." Fletcher Dunne kept learning. He was methodical about it, the same way he was methodical about everything. He set aside time every morning before the ranch work began, and he read what he could and wrote what he could, and he progressed the way serious people progress, which is not fast and not slow but steady, which is the only pace that holds. By midsummer he was reading the natural history books on his own. By fall he was reading the poetry. He came to the library every Thursday, same as he always had, and now he came on Saturdays too, though not always for books. And Cecily Marsh, who had kept herself company for 6 years and been content with that, found that she wasn't entirely content anymore. Not in a bad way, but in the way a room feels different once you've had a fire in the hearth. Even when the fire is out, you know what it felt like. You know it's possible. She kept the poem. Not the paper, he had that. But she kept it in her memory, all 6 lines, the way you keep the things that come to you at the right moment in the right voice. She could say it back to herself on the mornings, when the library was quiet and the light came through the west window at that flat golden angle, and the dust moved in it like it was something worth watching. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from seeing too much, from being the person in the room who notices everything, every hesitation, every small fear, every closed door that nobody else is to look at. People like that often end up alone, not because they're difficult but because they're present in a way that exhausts people who are used to being slightly unseen. Cecily Marsh had been that kind of lonely for a long time, and Fletcher Dunne had been a different kind. The kind that comes from carrying something you believe is shameful, alone, for so long that you start to forget there was ever another option. What I've always thought about their story is this: neither of them rescued the other. That's not what happened. What happened is that one person saw another person clearly, without flinching and without making a performance of it, and created enough space and enough time for that person to find their own way toward the light. And the other person, when he found it, turned around and offered his hand. That's not rescue. That's something rarer than rescue. Do you have any idea how hard it is to be seen? Truly seen, the parts you've kept in the dark as much as the parts you've put forward. And to have the person doing the seeing simply keep looking, without looking away, without making you feel small, without taking anything from you that you weren't ready to give. I don't think most of us do. I don't think most of us have had that experience. And I think most of us spend a good portion of our lives not knowing we're looking for it. Tell me, in the comments below, has anyone ever looked at the part of you that you were most certain would make them turn away, and stayed? And if they did, what did that change? Because if you ask me, that's the whole of it. That's what the story is really about. Not learning to read. Not 2 people finding each other in a small Colorado town at the far end of the 19th century. It's about what happens when someone refuses to look away.